OK, so now we'll start. Can I get a little bit less audio on this? I'm afraid I'm going to scream. Thank you. And then scare everybody. So good morning. So who was out past 2 a.m.? 3 a.m.? Anybody out past 4 a.m.? OK. Oh, yeah, that's impressive. I assume more people did stay out past 3 and 4 a.m., but we'll see them after lunch, not now. So those that were out that late, like some of my friends up here, were out till 3 a.m. and are here, which is both makes me feel honored, and also I feel guilty that they got so little sleep. So I hope this is good. So good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the conference. Trying to think. Well, I'm glad that you're all here. There's nothing to say. I was going to intro day 2 of the conference, but let's just get started. Let's get rolling. There we go. So my name is, OK, so you guys are here to talk about front-end development, specifically ReactJS and something called Webpack. There we go. This works. So my name is Ryan. I come from the United States. I speak a little bit of Spanish. So later, if you want to speak Spanish to me, I probably won't understand, but I'll reply in Spanish about something unrelated. So that will be fun. I work for KMP Labs, and I also work for KMP University and write tutorials there. How many people know of KMP University in this crowd? Awesome. I thought so. We obviously do a lot of Symfony stuff, so I'm glad that so many of you have heard of us. And if you've seen me talk before, then you know I always have to introduce my lovely and talented and amazing wife, Leanna, who always travels with me to the conferences, except for this time. So she's not here. Normally, I would point her out and make a big deal, and we'd all look at her and make her feel uncomfortable. And I might ask you later to give her high fives, or hugs or something. So Leanna's unfortunately not here. Leanna is quite pregnant, which not that many people know. So that's the reason she's not here. So we'll be having our first baby in 2 months. And so thank you. So this conference, I'll actually be getting a lot of sleep relative to a couple months from now. So it's not so bad. OK, so back to the talk. So the original title of this talk was finally Professional Front-End Development with ReactJS, Webpack, and Symfony. And I'm going to modify that a little bit to this very small goal, which is all of modern JavaScript in 45 minutes. And I'm going to not talk too quickly. So this will be a special challenge. And there is a reason for this, because let's say that you're only interested in using ReactJS or Angular. Once you start looking into it, you have all of these new terms and ideas that come at you that you need to learn before you actually get to your end goal. This was not the case with jQuery. jQuery was include this script tag and then write your first line of jQuery. And that's just not the case anymore. So we have these terms like ES6, ES2015, ECMAScript, Node.js, NPM, Babel, Webpack, ReactJS, JSX. There's another one called Harmony. These are the words that you see when you start looking into this. And when I started looking into this, I had no idea what these meant. And of course, whatever else comes out in the JavaScript land during our talk. So I like to tell people that modern JavaScript is a lot like Game of Thrones. So in Game of Thrones, you have countless characters that are fighting each other and trying to get influence. And in JavaScript, we have the same thing, right? There's an enormous amount of libraries that are competing standards that are fighting each other. Also in Game of Thrones, you have that character that you became really invested in. And you see where this is going. And then in JavaScript, you have that cool new framework that you use to rebuild your site for 6 months, only to find out that it is no longer cool the day that you go to deploy it. In fact, it's now embarrassing that you use it. So this is why front-end development is super, super challenging. So let's start with plain old JavaScript. It is just a language. We all realize that. And it's just a language that, of course, browsers happen to be able to execute. So this is very complex JavaScript right here. And of course, we know that will run in the browser. But most or all of you know at this point that we can also run this from the command line. So I'm just introducing the basics here because we need to know that Node.js is basically server-side JavaScript execution. And NPM is the composer for Node.js. Because even when you're doing front-end stuff, you're going to end up using a lot of Node.js and NPM. Okay? So Node.js, these are the basics to keep in mind as we go through things. Oh, by the way, yeah. So I will be showing code. If you want to follow along with the code, it's up on GitHub, or you can check that out later. And every commit is a very clean revision step through this tutorial, so you can look at the specific commits, if that's helpful during this. All right, so here is our very plain old JavaScript. This is a set of products for a sheep store, which seems incredibly random, but we're currently making a tutorial about making a store for sheep. So I'm reusing the example. And we have a function here that basically loops over some products and calls a function on the products. So it's just a very simple example. And there we go. Down here, actually, that's not important. So the important thing is that we have one JavaScript file. This is the way we code currently, right? And then at the bottom, we include that one script tag. And then when we run this thing, this is what comes out. So yeah, so all boring stuff so far. So what language is this then? And I'm sure some people know the answer to this. What was that? And what is that? Yeah. The answer was ES6, which is great because that was both correct and meaningless at the same time, right? So that's like me asking you how to say something in Spanish and you replying with how you say that word in Chinese. I'm like, that's not helpful. So yes, this is ES6. This is JavaScript, which is especially weird if you look at the top, because you see the class annotations on top. And this is another tricky thing when you start looking at modern JavaScript. You'll actually see libraries, and you'll read their documentation, and their examples of how to use their library will look like this. And you're like, what is going on? Sometimes even things like potentially jQuery plugins, not just stuff that's really, really new age. So a lot of those terms before we can define immediately. So there's something called ECMAScript, which is basically the official name of JavaScript. In the same way that PHP has a core team that decides what features should go into PHP, there's a group that basically decides what features and language features should go into JavaScript. The tricky thing with JavaScript, right, is that with PHP, there's like one PHP, and we put things into it, and then they're there. With JavaScript, they have to come up with more recommendations, and then it's up to the browsers and Node.js to follow those, because there's actually multiple engines for JavaScript. So when you hear ECMAScript, that's just JavaScript. So that takes care of that first problem. Then there's this, ES6/ES 2015/Harmony. Those are all referring to the same thing, which is ECMAScript version 6, which is the latest version of ECMAScript. So this would be like PHP 7, right? That's all this is referring to. So this code here is ECMAScript 6, ES6. Okay, this is valid JavaScript. This is not some new future crazy thing. This is the official standard. This is valid JavaScript code. But will it run in a browser? Maybe. Depends. It ran in my browser. Might not run in your browser. Because, of course, the problem is, right, that we have to wait for all the browsers to catch up. before we can use this. But I'm going to talk about that in a second. Real quick, because these are some of the most common things you'll see when you look at ES6, look at new JavaScript. You do have proper classes. So it's actually cool because they look really, really similar to classes in PHP. So this is valid, and I don't even need to explain it because it's very, very similar. You also have this thing called let, which is the same as var, but different. Did I write that up? Yeah, similar to var, but different. Isn't that helpful? So when you see let, it's just a way to define a variable. If you're interested, it changes the scope of the variable a little bit, but it's fairly similar. So if you see let, don't be like, what is happening with let? What's going on? It's not that scary. And, oh, my bad. There we go. And the last thing, which is one of the weirdest to look at initially, it's called the arrow function. And that is, oh, I thought I had an example up here. Oh, there it is, up top right. That's equivalent to that inline function. And there's actually a subtle difference. But when you see that arrow function, it's more or less a shorthand for those for an anonymous function that does that. So anyways, if nothing else, now we know what this is. So when you look at other libraries and their documentation is written like this, you don't necessarily have to use their library using this code. Meaning, like, if they show an example that looks like this, and you want to do it the old way, then do it the old way. That's fine. So just kind of do a translational thing. So great. So that's, especially the class stuff, that's awesome. I would like to use that. So I will just sail to an island for 5 years, and then wait there, and then sail back, and then we can use this, right? Fortunately not, because the JavaScript developers, fortunately, are very, very impatient. They don't want to wait 5 years. They want to use it right now. But they've learned that lesson from the past, that things like Internet Explorer will never move fast enough. So they had to come up with some insane idea to make things work, and that is Babel, which is a JS transpiler, which was a new term for me. Transpiler, apparently, is something that compiles source code to source code. So one source code to a different source code. So Babel's just a tool, so we're going to install it. And you're going to see me install lots of things with NPM. That's why I talked about it briefly earlier before. So with NPM, you have a package.json instead of composer.json. You've probably seen that before. So I'm going to start with a very basic package.json on my project. We're going to install Babel just with npm install babel-cli. In the --save-dev, you see that a lot with NPM. Unlike Composer, where things must go into your composer.json, and then you run composer install. If you don't do the --save-dev, it just downloads it, but doesn't put it into the package.json. So that little flag there, make sure it goes into your package.json. Cool. And there's the result there. So you can see it just, it's very similar to Composer, which is nice, because there's lots of ideas that carry over. So cool. So the end result of Composer, right, is we have a vendor directory. So the end result of NPM is we have node modules, which again, you guys have probably all seen node modules somewhere in a project or that referenced. It's just a directory in your project at this point. Also, like Composer, which is not that well known, sometimes with Composer, when you download an outside library, that outside library has a binary file. And so Composer symbolically links that into the vendor/bin directory. So a lot of times you'll see things like vendor/bin/php unit. And that's a symlink to an executable. So NPM does the same thing. It's node modules.bin. And so you'll have lots of executable files in there when you install them. Oh, by the way, you can also, because some people probably know this or are wondering, you can install things globally with NPM. So you'll see people do that as well, so that instead of writing this long thing, you can just say Babel. But it's all the same. So anyways, we run Babel. We point it at our source JavaScript, and we tell it to dump a new JavaScript file, right? And then, of course, we need to update our actual twig template, for example, to include the path to the built path. So really straightforward. But this doesn't change anything yet. If you compare those two files, the input and the output, they're actually identical. Or sometimes there might be slight space differences. So Babel is kind of a transpiling tool, which is probably something that you never knew you needed, but now you do. It actually parses the JavaScript code, can make transformations on it, and then dumps the JavaScript code. So out of the box, it does nothing. So it actually just read the source code and then just basically rewrote the source code. That's why they're identical, except maybe there's some space differences because it might write with a slightly different coding style. So for example, things that you can use it to transpile. CoffeeScript to JavaScript, probably the most famous transformation that we have. Coffee to tea, probably. And also, most importantly for us, ES6 JavaScript to ES5 JavaScript. Because like we saw earlier, that arrow function, it's not quite as simple as what I did, but that arrow function has a ES5, an old JavaScript equivalent. So we can actually write that into the old JavaScript. Oh, and important here is these transformations are called presets. So when you put a preset into Babel, you're saying you're adding a transformation to it. So you'll see me reference preset in the next few slides. So what we need to do is we need to install the ES 2015 ES6, because remember it has 10 names, preset into Babel. So again, we go back to NPM. We just install that package. And then in this case, we create a .babelrc file with nothing in it but this. That says you should now use the ES 2015 preset. And the next time we run Babel, it's going to look at that babelrc file. And this time it is going to transform the source code. So for example, this is the source here. This is part of the source file. And if you looked at the dumped file, it looks like this. So that's the exact thing that I was talking about earlier. Cool? So the big takeaway from this so far is that modern JavaScript actually has a build step. And you don't have, well, there are ways to avoid it, but like people who are actually front-end developers doing JavaScript, they're building their code through something. They have gone beyond the age of being able to just include script tags, and it just kind of works out of the box. So if you really want to get into that JavaScript thing, you need to sort of embrace that one way or another. Doesn't mean everyone has to run over and do that. In my sites, I have a mixture of like really modern stuff that has build scripts, and I also do things kind of the old school simple way. All right, so now we have ES6. I can use ES6 features. That's amazing because one of the new ES6 features is JavaScript modules. Because in the past, if we wanted to have our JavaScript split into multiple files, then we just had to include all the script tags, probably in the right order. Right, we know it's just kind of weird and messy. It's not very, just not good professional development. So fortunately, in ES6, they formalized the idea of JavaScript modules. Very similar to PHP classes. There's like one module per file, the same way we put one class per file. And you can put anything into it, but here's a file. So I took this product collection class, and I isolated it to its own file. And the details aren't important, but basically at the bottom of the file, or you can export a variable. Or you can even export multiple variables, actually. So we're just exporting that. So back in our main file, then, on the top, I can import that. And that / is literally a path. So you don't put the .js on the end, but it's just a path. So it's in the same directory as this. Cool? And now this hasn't changed here. I'm just highlighting that I'm still only including one file. I didn't have to add 2 script tags. Okay, only 1 script tag. And then, of course, we're going to run our Babel on that file. And it's not going to work. Damn. Because that was looking so good, wasn't it? You're like, oh, I can break things into multiple files? Yeah. So uncaught reference error require. And if you look at the error, it is actually coming from this line. So it transpiled, it converted that import statement into a require statement. The short story on that is that the require statement is something that's used in Node.js to require other files. So basically, the Babel was saying, well, import is an ES6 feature. Let me turn it into this ES5 feature that may or may not work depending on what environment you're in. So like, for example, this code would run in Node.js. But browsers do not have that require function because basically module loading in a browser is very, very difficult. Because if I require something in Node.js, it's the same way as PHP, right? It just goes and reads that file synchronously, immediately. But of course, on the web, right, if I want to require a file, some other JavaScript file, it's got to go download it, which takes some amount of milliseconds. So it's an asynchronous operation. So the point is, requiring modules is just really complicated in a browser, and lots of people have tried to solve it in various different ways. And we're going to solve it today in a various different way. So introducing Webpack, which is really the tool that ties all of this stuff together. So it's called a bundler. It's called a module loader. We'll talk about what it actually does. So first, we're going to install it. Got it? Second, we're going to change the import and export to, the import and export to a slightly different format. And I'll tell you why in a second. So instead of the export product collection, we're going to say modules.export equals product collection. And then down here, we're going to use the require statement instead of the import statement. The big reason is like it's called common JS. Basically, this is code that, well, actually, I'm not going to explain that yet. Just trust me on it. This Webpack tool works out of the box with this module.exports and this require common JS way of including modules. We're going to come back to the other way in a second. So now we use Webpack in the same way that we use Babel. We pointed at the source file. We give it an output file. So life is good. And this time, it actually works. It actually follows the import and sucks both files into one final file. So it's the same idea we've been doing for like 10 years with JavaScript, where you want to have like 10 JavaScript files and compile them into one for performance. This is ultimately that same thing's happening, but it's for a totally different reason, right? We didn't start down this path for performance. We started down this path because I want to be able to write a JavaScript file, import another JavaScript file, and just and have it work. And this is now happening by it actually importing all these files. So you can see here at the bottom, the product app is 512 bytes. The product collection is 250 bytes. But the one compiled file is 2.24 kilobytes because Webpack has to add some of its own tools into there. That's why those don't add up exactly to the same thing. All right, to make Webpack easier to use, you are going to have a configuration file. I'm not going to show too much of this configuration file. So you have webpack.config.js. This is basically just repeating what I was doing from the command line a second ago. Here's your input file. Here's your output file. I'm not going to show it today, but you can also have multiple input files and multiple output files. A lot of times when you read tutorials on the web about this stuff, they sort of assume you have a single-page app, like you have one JavaScript file. But you're like, no, I have like a mini JavaScript app on the home page, and then on the products page, I have another mini JavaScript app, right? I have many little JavaScript apps on my site, and that is possible. So ultimately, this configuration does change one thing. The output file is slightly different. I just did that to show off that feature. So the input file has this little name I made up called product. And because I did use that square bracket name.js thing, it kind of puts that in there. That's kind of starting to show off the way you do multiple entry points. You would have just another thing under entry, and then it would just dump multiple files using that name pattern. All right. So now we can just run Webpack. So life is good. And it just reads that input file, dumps the output file. Cool. So life is good because now we can actually write modular JavaScript, but we lost our ES6 features. Webpack doesn't do that ES6 to ES5 transformation. So we got to be like, yo, Webpack, here's the thing. When you do that whole module loading thing, I need you to take that code and push it through Babel. That would be awesome, because then we can get that ES6 functionality back. And the way that Webpack does this is with something called loaders. I'll show you the code there. So we're going to install something called Babel loader. And then in that same webpack.config.js, we're just going to configure Webpack to say, when you see a JS file, put it through that loader. And when you hear loader, I want you guys to think of just something that just transforms source. Kind of similar to the way that Babel was transforming source. They have different purposes, but ultimately this says, hey, when you see a JS file, go pass it through this filter over here, and it's going to change it and then give it back to me. So the test key there, which initially I thought was kind of weird. I was like, are we writing a test? What's going on? That basically is every time a file is loaded in Webpack, it goes through all of the loaders and just looks at that test there and just does a regular expression on it to see if this file applies to that. So if we had some other not .js file, it obviously wouldn't go through this filter. And then, so far, we need to run Webpack again, right? Because we need to recompile the asset. And now it's going to recompile down. And now we have our ES6 support and our module loading. So this is good. And at this point, we can if we want to, and I'm going to because it's something you'll start to see more and more. I'm actually going to change my importing of files, my module stuff, back to the new ES6 way of doing things. So a second ago, I said, no, you have to use the require function when you use Webpack. Now we can change it back to use the export and the import. So the difficult thing with this is there's a lot of pieces, right? So you use import and export. What happens is when that loads, that goes through Babel, which actually converts these to require statements. And then Webpack understands require statements and then goes and loads all the files and puts them together. So Babel and Webpack working together are key here, but it's, like I said, it's actually several pieces working together. And then once we make that change, if we want to see if that's working, we need to run Webpack again. So as you can see, that's starting to get kind of annoying. So, and this is a problem in everything in JavaScript, or if you're writing things in Sass, you know, like you have to like recompile Sass every time you make a Sass change. There's always there has to be some way around this so we can make our life a little bit better. So in Webpack, it has a tool called Webpack Dev Server. So at this point, we're going to install it, because that's what we do. And then we're going to run the Webpack Dev Server. So once again, it's another binary that's going into the node modules directory. And notice I say --content-base equals web, because what this does, if you look at the top, it actually starts a web server on localhost :8080, which is serving files from the web directory. This is very similar to the built-in PHP web server. You can say, hey, PHP, go serve files from this directory. This is doing the same thing. And if I go to localhost :8080/faveicon.ico, some physical file that exists, it will return it. But the key thing is that if I go to localhost :8080, and then I go to the path to my compiled asset, which I think is /builds/product.js, that doesn't read a physical file. That actually calculates what that file should look like right now from memory. So basically, this little web server here will always have the most up-to-date version of my compiled JavaScript. So the only problem is that now we need to go and change all of our script tags everywhere on the site. Like in Symfony, like we now need to point at an external web server. And of course, we need to only do that in the dev environment. So that's kind of a problem, right? So the way to fix that, and some of you have probably seen this before, but if you haven't, this is an amazing random feature of Symfony. In Symfony, you can just, with a little bit of configuration here, say, every time I use the asset function, I want you to prefix that asset with this host name. And the purpose of this was actually for CDNs. You know, if you deploy to a CDN, you can, on production, point everything at that CDN. But it comes in handy here, because now everything's going to use our little localhost :8080. So when you look at the source code now, all of our CSS JS files are pointing at this localhost :8080 thing. And I wasn't going to show the next slide, but since you guys are all Symfony developers, it's actually interesting. The problem with this solution is then you need to like change that before you deploy, right? Because you don't want all of your assets on production going to some imaginary localhost :8080. So the way that I would actually solve this is by making a parameter in parameters.yml. So use Webpack Dev Server. And then in app kernel, this is also a feature that you don't see people use very often. In app kernel, at the bottom of app kernel, there's that line that says go load config.yml or go load config_dev.yml. Below that, if you want to, you can actually use this syntax here, this closure syntax, and you can actually dynamically use if statements to change things about the way the framework's configured. So we're manually using some logic here to read that parameter and then effectively tweak what is normally in config.yml based on that parameter. Cool. So at this point, we can use ES6 features. We can import and export modules. So it seems like we're in really, really good shape, and we are. But I'm going to make an argument that as far as when I'm building my JavaScript app, I can now import outside files, and Webpack will bring those all together for me. So I no longer have to worry about including many script tags. But I do have to worry about including the right CSS. Because oftentimes you write a CSS file that kind of styles this page, and this page is kind of run by this JavaScript file. So CSS itself is sort of a dependency to your little JavaScript application. So instead of me having to manually include a CSS file, instead of me having to manually include a JS file and then remember to include the CSS file that kind of goes with that, it would be kind of cool. I don't know how it would work. It would be kind of cool if I could do something like this. So in the same way I import a JavaScript file, could I import a CSS file and then have Webpack somehow understand what to do with that? And the answer, of course, is no. That's insane. That doesn't work. But notice the error you get when you try this. It says you may need an appropriate loader to handle this file. And we saw loaders earlier. This is a slide from earlier. Loaders are those things like whenever you open a file, like sends it through a loader, or maybe it doesn't, and that changes it in some way. So Webpack's actually giving us a hint here and saying, I actually can load CSS, but you have to install the correct loader so I actually understand what that means. So there's a loader called the CSS loader. So we're going to install that. And then we're going to run the CSS file through that loader. There's two ways to run a file through a loader. Either you do it in configuration, where you say all files that end in .css go through this loader, or you can actually prefix the file and use an exclamation point. It's a little bit of a weird syntax. I wanted to show it to you here because you'll see both of them. And I don't want you to be like, what is that exclamation thing going on here? So basically, it would load the CSS file. It goes from right to left. It would load the CSS file and then run it through that CSS filter. OK? There we go. So that actually works. You don't get an error. What that does is it actually parses the CSS file, puts it into a JavaScript kind of data object. So it's almost this variable in JavaScript that describes all of the rules in your CSS file. But that's it. It doesn't do anything with that. It doesn't put that on your page. It's just like, good for you. You converted CSS to a JavaScript version of that CSS, but nothing happens with it. So we actually need one other loader for this, and it's called the style loader. So we're going to install that style loader, and then we're actually going to add that as well to our CSS. So again, things move from this side over to this side. So it loads the CSS file. It goes through the CSS loader, which converts it into this JavaScript structure of the CSS. And then it goes through the style loader. And what the style loader does is it takes that and actually writes a style tag directly to the head of your page. So what this means is that when I run Webpack now, my final JS file is actually 2 JavaScript files and a CSS file inside of it. Like it encodes the CSS file in a certain way, which feels really weird. I totally agree if you're thinking that. So that's what I thought when I did this. I was like, wait, I don't have a CSS file anymore. It's like inside of my JavaScript file, and it adds a style tag to my page. Like, it just feels kind of wrong. But that's exactly what it does. And I'm not going to show it here, but you can, and we do on our site, you can configure Webpack to not embed certain CSS, but actually to export a standalone CSS file. So what I'm trying to say is, like, this is what happens by default, but you can still have it export its own standalone CSS file if you want to. Because sometimes you need that because you have a CSS file that's used on many pages, so you don't want it jammed into like 5 different JavaScript files. So anyways. But the big takeaway here is that my template hasn't changed. I still include only one JavaScript file, but suddenly that's including JavaScript and CSS. And this is just the syntax for showing how you do that loader inside of configuration instead of doing it in line with the exclamation point thing. So you can see it's very, very similar. So there's one other thing I need to show you guys, which is this, because we just broke this a little bit. So normally when you write CSS, you know how to reference images or fonts, right? Usually you do like a relative. So I'm going up one directory to an images directory, then finding logo.png. But I just broke that because now that the CSS is in line, and even if you do that other thing where it writes a separate file, you still have the same problem. Now that the CSS is in line, if I am at this URL, then it looks like I'm looking for that PNG. Because the CSS is physically on the page, so it just looks at the URL and goes, OK, .. this. So that's just going to change based on what URL you're on. So we just totally messed up all of our assets. But even before worrying about that, if I added that line to my CSS, I'm instantly going to get this error from Webpack. which is you need an appropriate loader to handle that file. This is really, really cool because Webpack is loading the CSS file, and it's actually also loading all of the imports, if you import other CSS files, or URL functions in your CSS, for background images and that kind of stuff. It's actually parsing all that stuff and trying to load that stuff too. So yes, we can actually even have this take care of our images. In the same way that CSS is a dependent of JavaScript, even the images need to come along, because if we're moving the CSS file, then we have to take the images with us. So we're actually going to install something called the URL loader and also something else called the file loader. And let me just show you, and I'm just going to configure it like this with the PNG, but I want to show you guys what it does. So with the URL loader, because now that we have this working for PNG files, and in real life you'd have this working for all files, so I'd have a little regular expression for PNG, JPEG, GIF, all that kind of stuff. Whenever it encounters one of these files in a CSS file, for example, it either does one of two things. If the file is small enough, it actually turns it into a base64 encoded. Have you ever seen those long URL thingy? It's basically an image file that's in a string, and actually inlines that into your built CSS. If it's greater than 10 kilobytes, then for performance purposes, and it's 10 kilobytes because I configured it that way, it actually copies that into the builds directory, and then in your CSS file, it changed your URL to make sure that it resolves to look at that new file. So this is all a way, and I went to great lengths to tell you all of the pitfalls that you're going to run into with this kind of stuff. This is all a way for us to stop thinking about our JavaScript as kind of this random script, and we have these random styles over here, and the styles point to these images over here, and start thinking about your JavaScript as a complete standalone application that can actually be packaged together. And it's complicated because JavaScript never stands alone. JavaScript is attached to other JavaScript, which is attached to CSS, which references images, which references fonts. And if you're going to package this whole thing up, you can't leave any of those things behind. They all have to be present. So Webpack takes those and puts them all together for you. So I spent a lot of time on Webpack because that's one of the biggest problems you run into when you do ReactJS or actually other things, is this problem of sort of needing a build step. And the build step, Webpack, happens to be a fairly complex tool to use. So now we can finally actually get into Node.js, ReactJS kind of stuff. So Node.js we know is server-side JavaScript. We're writing client-side JavaScript, right? So we can't use Node.js libraries, except that we can use Node.js libraries. So there's a fairly famous library in Node.js called Lodash. It's just got a bunch of utility functions in it. So if we want to use Lodash in our JavaScript, our front-end JavaScript, all we need to do is install it with NPM, import it, and then use it. And that's it. Webpack's going to take care of everything else after that, because Webpack's now going to go into the Lodash library and include that in our final built JavaScript. We didn't have to go to some other template and include a new script tag, or some other configuration file and make sure that Lodash is included in some compiled assets. We just write our JavaScript, and then Webpack's going to take care of everything for us after that. Also, when you import or require things, you've seen most of my examples so far have had // something. So if you're including a file that's right in the same directory as you, then you use // or // something like that. But that indicates that it's relative to where you are right now. If you don't have a // in front of it, then it knows to look in your node modules directory. It's so it knows to get a vendor library. All right. So I showed you that because ReactJS is just another library, in the same way that Lodash is a library. So this is a stereotypical Hello World ReactJS application. So the big thing in ReactJS is you create these little objects, and the objects always have a render function, and in the render function you output HTML. And then ultimately, you're going to use this once on your page to basically say, oh, that product app thing up there, I want you to render that. And I, on my template, have a product-app ID somewhere, right? So it's pretty straightforward, except what the heck are those things? Because that's not real JavaScript. That's a syntax error. I did not wrap those in quotes. That was not an accident. So those are called JSX. So in the building pyramid of like brand new terms and why doesn't JavaScript look like JavaScript anymore, we have another thing. And JSX is an XML add-on onto JavaScript, but it's not official. It's not the ECMAScript thing. This is just a side thing. It would be like as if somebody made, I don't know, maybe like a PHP extension, right? They wrote it in C, right? And you could install it into your PHP if you wanted to, but it's not there by default. So this is not something official, but it just compiles down to normal JavaScript. So this would be the transformation that would take place. And Babel can handle doing this transformation in the same way it did the ES6 to ES5 thing. But it doesn't yet. So if you run that code right now, you're going to get exactly what you should, which is an error, because it's going to read that file and be like, what is this random HTML tag that you've included in the middle of your JavaScript? But at this point, that's no big deal for us, because you're going to install that preset, and you're going to configure it in Babel RC. And this is what my Babel RC file looks like. It's just got these two things. These are like the main two transformations you need to make, the ES6 one and the React one, which does the JSX stuff. All right, cool. Now, if you do that, you're going to get another error, which is going to be this, which is cannot resolve module React. And this is actually a really, really easy one for us to solve at this point. Because if you look back at the original code, look at the first line. When I went to the React documentation and copied this into my project, not knowing what I was doing, I copied that code. But I don't have a library called React. So we need to install that via NPM so they can actually go and import that. So no problem. Let's install React and then the other one I was using, which is React-DOM. So that's the same as we just did a second ago with Lodash. And of course, we know that Webpack is just going to grab all of those libraries and put them into our JavaScript file. So we have all of our dependencies. We don't need to include another script tag on our page. Remember to do that. It's all going to get sucked into that one file. And this is an example of that. So when you actually build it this time, because I wanted to show you this, you'll see you end up with a product.js file. Now notice that file size is pretty huge, 3.27 megabytes. There's two big things I want to say about that. One of them is that this is purposely big because it's not being minified yet. And there's also a couple of flags that you'll end up setting in your code that actually tells ReactJS to even go into a smaller state. So basically, this is the purely like source code. We also have, this also includes source maps. So basically, in real life, the file size would actually be quite a bit smaller than this. But it's going to be as big as it needs to be because you've told it to include React. Like you're using React in your project. So however big React is, that's going to go into your JavaScript file, your one JavaScript file. Additionally, which I'm not going to go into, with Webpack, there's ways to actually split your files into multiple pieces. It actually has the ability to load files asynchronously. So you can actually make it so you have a small JavaScript file. And then once that JavaScript file starts running, it can asynchronously go download other JavaScript files. It's called file splitting or module splitting. So there's all kinds of complexities you can get into if you want to basically like make your file size smaller. But this is one of the difficult things for me when I use Webpack is that I was always thinking about what files I needed to include and how big the file size was going to be. I was coming from the standpoint of when I have a build process with JavaScript, it's for optimization. I want to make my JavaScript files as perfectly small as they should be. Webpack forces you to think about that differently. It says, forget about that. Just write your JavaScript. Just write good modular JavaScript and let Webpack do its job. Then, later, look at Webpack and see if it's doing a bad job. Webpack actually has a visualization tool that can show you all of your dependencies, and you can actually look at this tree and say, hold on a second, ReactJS is being packaged into these 3 modules, and so the user's downloading it 3 separate times. Let's isolate that into its own module and basically make the file sizes smaller. So that's kind of another track you can go down, but the point is you can optimize, you're supposed to optimize Webpack afterwards, and it has really amazing tools to do that. So ReactJS itself, at least getting into it and building your first app, it's actually quite easy. It's all the steps up to this, which are what causes people to kind of be like, ooh, I don't know what's going on. So, but I do want to give you guys some basics here, because now I want to sort of celebrate that we can actually put this whole thing together. So React 101, first thing you guys need to know about is something called props, which if you read ReactJS at all, you're going to know about. There's 2 things, props and state. So here, I've actually created a new JavaScript file, which creates a React component and exports it. And I'll show you the code in the middle of this for a second. But we have this product list component. And then from our main JavaScript file, we're going to import the product list component. And we're just going to render it below there. But the important part is when you render a component or when you reference a component, you can actually pass it information, arguments. These are called props. So I'm basically passing it a variable saying message equals great products. And then because of that, in that object, I can reference this.props.message. OK? So you're just going to be passing around props from one object to another. Important thing about props is that they are not mutable. You don't change them. So props are things that are static in your application. And there's one other thing I needed to say about this slide. Also notice that when you're in the weird JSX land, you can write JavaScript. You just do a curly brace. So that this.props.message is JavaScript. So curly brace, and then you write whatever JavaScript you want. Awesome. A more complex example of using props. So in this case, we're going back to our products array. And I'm going to pass my products in as a prop called initial products. Cool. So this is getting a little more realistic right now. Right now, you're like, yeah, I have an app. And that app is actually going to make a table of the products. So I'm at some point going to need to pass that product information into my JavaScript app. So this is what we're going towards. So I've got these top-level products. I pass them in as initial products. And then we're going to need to render those in that subcomponent. And this is a little bit more of a complex slide. So I'm going to touch on some key bits here. But if you want, you can look at this code later. This is one of the more complicated things when you start dealing with collections with React. So I wanted to actually kind of show it to you guys. So here, first thing I do is I'm just looping over that this.props.initialProducts. So I'm just looping over the products. And inside of there, I'm actually pushing some HTML onto this array called product rows. Okay, and then other than that, it's basically the same. You can see I'm using some JavaScript in there, curly brace product, and also I'm making it have a random price with all the math.round kind of stuff. So ultimately here, I end up with a variable called product rows, which is a collection of those little JSX snippets. Which is important because down below, I can take that product rows and actually print it. So that's the important part in the T-body, is I've done all the preparation up here of the kind of HTML, and then down here I can just echo that variable, and that's going to all come out correctly. So from a prop standpoint, I want you guys to see props in action. Also, this is, like I said, the collection handling, which is one of the more complicated things that you'll do immediately because you're always handling collections of things. So this was two more things that I want to talk about with that I want you guys to know leaving here about ReactJS so you can actually start using it. One thing that I've seen a lot, you guys ever have that feeling like when you're learning a new library, you have like this question, and you're sure that everyone on earth that uses the library must have this question, but no one seems to be answering it? You're like, what is going on? This was my thing here, which is initial data. So if we have this application that's going to load, so the page loads, right? And we are going to have a list of products on that page. And maybe it has a bunch of JavaScript functionality. But the point is there's a list of products that are going to be on our page rendered via JavaScript. Where does that data come from? Well, we have a couple options. One, we could, right when the page loads, in JavaScript, we can make an AJAX call and go get that data. But that kind of sucks because that's unnecessarily adding a delay to your user seeing the content. When really, for example, in your Twig template, you're like, I have the products right here in my Twig template. Can I give them to my JavaScript application? So you see things that look like this, where you always have the starting data in a JavaScript file, which is just not realistic because you're like, how did it get there? How would I do this in real life? So the way that I handle this, at the very least, and I want to give you guys permission to do the same thing, is by putting things on the window variable inside of my actual Twig template. So in my Twig template, I will communicate into my JavaScript application by putting some things on the window variable and then referencing those in my product app.js file. Var starting products equals window.starting products. Okay. And by the way, that's the only place that I ever reference window in my JavaScript applications. So if I'm ever in a further file down, like for example, if I were in, I don't have here, that other JavaScript file that is included in this one, I wouldn't reference window there. Window is this like global thing, so I reference it kind of on top, and then I don't reference it further below. It's kind of the same way, the same idea of a Symfony controller. There are certain things you do in a Symfony controller, like go grab kind of some global configuration and mix things together, that you wouldn't necessarily do in a service. You want services to be pure and a little more decoupled from your application, so it's the same thing. All right. Then the last thing I want to talk about is React state. So I mentioned earlier that you have these variables called props, but props never change. And the whole point of React is for you to be able to render a variable, same way we're rendering a variable here, except that when that variable changes, like when somebody somewhere changes the message prop, it automatically updates our HTML. And that's the whole point of having JavaScript front-end frameworks. So instead of having this be this.props.message, we're going to, because we have determined that this is a value that might change, instead of using props, we're going to use state. So we're going to say this.state.message. I'm also going to add a little button below there, which we're going to click, and it's going to change the message. And I'll show that in a second. OK, so this.state.message, if we did nothing else, that's going to print an empty string. We haven't set that anywhere. So how do we initially set the state? We do that by having a getInitialState function inside of your components. So right above the render function or whatever below, you have something that looks like this, and you can actually set what your initial state is. Okay? Now, I didn't show it here, but oftentimes you set the initial state from the props. So for example, if that list of products is actually something that's going to change because you're dynamically going to be adding more products, well, you still have an initial set of products. So you would still pass the initial products as props, but then you would use those props to set a product's state. So it would look something like products : this.props.initial products, or something like that. So you read that into state. So point is, now we actually have state. So let's go back and look at that button. So this is actually one of the things I also like is to attach event listeners, you sort of delightfully return to 1996 with onClick. It actually works really well. It's just kind of funny that we were told to stop doing this like 15 years ago, and now you actually see it here again. So onClick, and you basically give it the name of a function in this same React component called handleClick. And that's what handleClick looks like. The nice thing about when you attach events like this in React is the code looks exactly like when you attached events in jQuery. So it's not like some different event handling system or something like that. You actually have like the E variable. You call e.preventDefault, and everything just kind of like works normal. But the point here is, once we know that we need to change the state, you just call this.setState, and then it's not going to automatically update anywhere that you're referencing that state variable. Okay, so that's the kind of classic thing with front-end frameworks. In reality, right here, what you'd actually do, right, is you'd maybe like make an AJAX call, and then on success, you'd get some data back. But ultimately, you just go and reference that state. So the big thing with ReactJS are like props and state. The unprops are not changed. State are things that change. It's like one of the, I think it's the second article on React's documentation. It's called Thinking in React, which is one of those pages that goes through like this whole kind of, it's like one of those philosophical documentation pages, which we usually all hate to read because they're just full of like a bunch of garbage. It's actually really good. So read that Thinking in React, and it tells you a lot about state and props and how to make your application. OK, whew. So putting all this stuff together, we now know what these terms are. That's the newest version of JavaScript, and it's legit, except that not all browsers run it. So we use Babel and its presets to transform that code into old school JavaScript that allows us to use the new features. Then we brought in Webpack because Webpack gives us the ability to actually like import outside files into one spot. And of course, we tacked on some loaders so it could handle things like running JS through Babel and running CSS into inline styles. And then finally, we were able to get to ReactJS. By the way, you don't technically need a build step for ReactJS, but you won't be able to use their JSX, that XML-like format. You'll have to do like this longer kind of pure JavaScript-y type thing, which I don't think very many people do. So finally, we were able to get to ReactJS, which is all about the props and the state. And this is like really where you actually start having fun with things. So the last word of warning is like, when I was putting this presentation together, I was like, this stuff's not easy. This stuff is fairly difficult. This is a very heavy presentation to put all this stuff together. So the JavaScript world is moving very, very quickly. It has for years, and it's one of the problems because you don't know if you're jumping on a sinking ship that's going to change as soon as you do something with it. That being said, the ES6 stuff is not going away. ES6 is staying. That's a standard. That is JavaScript official language. That is safe to jump on. Babel is probably not going away. And if it is, it's probably going to get replaced by something that does the exact same thing. It's that idea of having a build step in JavaScript so that when new features are added, we don't have to wait 10 years for browsers to support them. That idea is not going away. Something like Webpack, that idea is not going away. Will Webpack win the race? That gets a little bit more iffy. But like that idea of bundling things together and getting a final product is not going away. And of course, we all know that front-end frameworks are not going away. We'll see who wins between React and Angular and all that kind of stuff. So, tread carefully and don't jump off the cliff and go bleeding edge on this stuff. But if you are a front-end developer, you do front-end stuff, this stuff is not going to wash away. Like a lot of these concepts are things that I would highly recommend that you look into. And even that being said, for all the complexity, we rewrote all of Camp University's JavaScript to use Webpack in under a week and deployed it. And it's working awesome. So it's not just like an in-theory thing. I love using it. All right. Thank you guys very, very much.